Hey everyone, welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I am Blake. I'm here with Doug and Kyle. We are pastors at Living Springs Church, and we are excited to answer your questions this week and thrilled to take you through all the twists and turns of faith and maybe some rabbit holes as we go. So we are ready. Are you guys ready?
Think so?
I think I am.
Perfect. Well, let's jump in. We got some AER this week.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
So, on last week's topic of friendships with the opposite sex, do you think your assessment of the situation might be coming from being raised in the purity culture era or mindset? I would argue that it might be skewed view, and we'd be curious to know how you feel purity culture impacted each of you, both in your teens to now.
I can't remember when I started talking about this, if it was on recording last week or in our lengthy discussion once the cameras were off.
We did discuss more after, yes.
Yeah. So I
That's always a struggle.
Totally. I do remember talking about this. I don't know, though, if we captured that on the podcast, where it's, for me, impossible to separate what part of my thinking is still impacted by that, but I completely agree. I think the culture I was raised in, I can't speak for the other guys, absolutely for a long period of time deeply affected my ability to interact with women in ways that were not skewed by that way of thinking. There's lots of ways to overcorrect that you can completely ignore some of the cautions that we were alluding to last week. So I don't think that's the response either. But I feel like I've done some balancing there. But yeah, it's impossible for me to be able to understand a way outside of the way that I was raised to some degree without bias.
So, I don't know if that was some veiled dig at our age when you started with, well, I can't speak for the other guys.
No, I don't know. I don't think you guys were in the full purity culture movement with like prom and promise rings and all that.
I think it was a veiled dig at our age.
I was more. I wasn't thinking that fully as much as just I don't know how deep and entrenched you were to whatever.
I was
culture.
actually taking the AER as a compliment.
No, I'm talking
like,
Kyle. When he was like, well, I can't speak for the other guys, but for me, I was alive and young.
I can't speak to your experience was all I was thinking.
I had to throw you under the bus.
I know. True. So maybe Kyle's thinking that, but I was thinking the questioner assumes that I grew up in the purity culture, which makes me younger than I am, which I'm like, thank you, questioner.
And I'm of the same way. I'm like, wow, I was a youth pastor when purity culture kind of became a thing. Mm-hmm. So I did not grow up in purity culture.
But you've alluded in other episodes where the culture that became purity culture was already brewing while you were growing up in your teen years. Some of the language became more extreme and the practices became more prevalent. But I believe you guys were impacted by that line of thinking just in an earlier stage.
Sure, but I don't think that's like when I think of purity culture, I think of a certain time when it became was it promise rings?
Yeah, that was all out of the guy who's since renounced his whole way of thinking.
That was Eygpt dating goodbye guy?
Yeah.
That was like the marking book of purity culture.
Right, and that was, like, I was married and a youth pastor when that became a thing.
You and kissed dating goodbye, too.
We had
I had at that point kissed dating goodbye. Yes,
You're
correct.
We had Airdrie. There's a bunch of teens in Airdrie. I think there was a couple from this church and maybe that Airdrie Alliance that made shirts.
Right.
Can't remember if it was virginity is cool or whatever. Like it was. Abstinence is awesome. Yeah, that was the thing. And then they made me a specific one that said abstinence was awesome before I was married. That was so.
Abstinence used to be cool.
But I think that there's and yes, I think that like nothing happens in a vacuum, and the purity culture didn't begin in an instant.
No.
And certainly there was foundational things laid. But I do think, like, when people have submitted questions about the purity culture, and when you have talked about it both on the podcast and our conversations alone, I want to just recognize that what a lot of people went through of your age was not something that I went through.
Yep.
And I want to distinguish that
Yep.
because I don't want to blur all of those lines into this mix of saying, yeah, well, I'm a part of that, because there was this, I think things reached this so out of balance place
Yep.
that it was very damaging. And I don't know that it was that damaging for me when I was a youth. Like, I remember when I was a youth, and it was like, hey, don't have sex till you're married.
Yep.
And that was pretty much the end of the conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it wasn't, there wasn't all of this, you know, I kiss dating goodbye, I'm looking for a spouse. If you wait, sex will be awesome. Like, and maybe that was because I grew up in a small town youth group with youth leaders who were not always youth pastors.
Right.
So there was a very much an element of isolation with my youth group.
Right.
Even when so I was well into high school before we got our first youth pastor, I believe. And I remember youth leaders who were people in the church who helped out with youth. And it was very much a self-contained thing. And so those youth leaders were running the show.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's my exact same experience here.
yeah, and so I think part of even the whole I Kiss Dating Goodbye thing is what grew out of some of the YC movement, because YC was huge in Alberta in the 90s. But like, I remember going to YC as a teen in the 80s in Ontario because it was starting then. And this sense of like groups coming together and connecting, which I think built to this place where all of a sudden there was curriculum being offered. And as a youth leader, especially youth leaders who were oftentimes not in paid positions, you could tap into some of these resources that became available that when I was in youth just didn't exist.
Right. Yep.
And so I think there's an element simply of, because of my age, it was just a different time.
Yep.
There was no internet, right? And there just weren't the same resources.
Sure.
And so youth was these few people, and then at one point, like, I think it was a part-time guy who came in as a youth pastor, and it was like whatever they could think of.
Yeah.
And I often wonder, how did they think of anything? Like, I mean, when I'm running the youth, one of the first things I do for like games and activities,
Google.
Yes, exactly. And not that I always take those games and activities, but those are the impetus that I'll read a game and I'll be like, okay, wait, I can take that and I can put my own spin on it. But the inception starts in Google. And then I think back to the mid-90s when I was the youth pastor the first time here in Airdrie, and I'm like, man, we didn't have Google. Like, we just thought of things. And I think that's why there was, like, your youth group got 2 or 3 games that you found that were really popular and the kids loved, and you just kept going back to that well.
Totally.
Because you didn't have that resource. So I just think there's a difference, and I want to just acknowledge that.
Yep.
So I will say, I want to clarify my comments on last week. When I talk about male-female relationships, and that I think, and I stand by what I said, that more often than not, one of the two is interested in more than just a friendship. I want to differentiate. That's not groups of friends,
right?
Because I think there are groups of friends where there's males and females and they connect, and that's one thing. I think, but when you have one guy and one girl, and there's this deep, intimate relationship, and I will just stand by it based on 55 years of observing human behavior. More often than not, and I said that last week. I'm not saying it's a universal truth. I think more often than not, one of the two of them is interested in more than a friendship.
Right.
So I could be wrong. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying in all of my experience, I have seen that to be the case more often than not.
So with that, just tying it into last week's conversation, if I can, I know I'm a little bit playing the role of host, but what if that is the statement you are standing to, and I have no problem with it for you, what would the boundaries be that you would tell somebody based on the question last week, biblical platonic boundaries with relationships for the other sex? So how would you walk that out if that's the base truth?
And that's what I got into last week was, if you're two single people, you've every right to be in that relationship. There's no problem at all. The boundary and the thing I think you need to be aware of is to honor that other person.
Fair.
I think you need to be honest, and I think you need to be loving, in that if you get a sense that that person wants more than what you're willing to give, you need to be fair to that person.
Entirely fair.
and you can't, like, oftentimes I think people play ignorant and I can think of specific situations when like I know there was either a girl who was into a guy who was seemingly oblivious, or a guy who was, and I can think of those situations in this church in my time here.
Right.
Wasn't there a young lady that was doing your laundry when you were in Bible college? Don't I remember that story?
No. That must be somebody else.
Well, I thought it was you that had said that, and we all laughed at you because we were like, she was obviously interested. You're like, no, she just like doing my laundry. Someone told me the story. I won't put it on you. Somebody told me that story once.
I don't remember that at all. But I feel like that would be a good indication.
That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, and I can think of situations and people in this church where there was never like. Anybody who was looking objectively at it was like, one of these two people is more into the other one than the other one is. Right. And the other one is either oblivious or choosing not to acknowledge this. And so the only, I think, requirement, the only standard is a genuine honoring of that person in the relationship. An honest conversation about what you're prepared to offer. Mm-hmm. Because as a single person, I don't think you have to have... boundaries on platonic relationships, except for if you have even an inkling that person wants more than what you're willing to give.
No dragging them along.
I think you need to be honest and you need to be real with them.
Yep.
So,
just curious where the rubber meets the road with that.
Yeah, and I think the challenge comes when you're married. Yeah. That you need to recognize that that can become a slippery slope. That doesn't mean you don't build friendships with females. That doesn't mean you don't engage with people for us females, for women, men, but with people of the opposite sex. But I think it just means you have to recognize the possibility of that happening in your own heart and your unwillingness to acknowledge it until it's too late. Yeah. And that's the problem, I think, is that our heart will deceive us. Right. And we can start down a path being like, oh, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing. When if we were being honest with ourselves, we'd have to acknowledge there's just a little bit of flirtatious, a little bit of something going on that is the beginning. Yeah. And yes, I can say nothing wrong has happened, but I'm on a path to something wrong happening.
Right.
Sure.
Fair. Thanks.
I think specifically of my parenting, like into my teens, and even how I taught our teens for all the years that I did youth ministry. I didn't grow up in purity culture, as we just said, but I definitely grew up with biases that came from my own experiences. I was encouraged by some important people in my life to date everyone that I could find. And I don't think I treated women fairly or kindly in any way through my dating years, including my wife, who somehow stuck it out and I'm now married to. So yes, I definitely, when I was giving instructions to my own teens, my own kids, or to teens that I was youth pastor to or youth leader to, that definitely came out of my biases. So to this question, to the AER specifically, yeah, absolutely. Whether that's skewed or not, I was teaching out of my own personal experiences for sure. Yeah.
And I think we all do. I think we need to recognize that.
Yeah.
Like we are the sum of our experiences.
Yeah.
And so, and that's why for me, where I come to in this conclusion is the just looking out at humanity for 55 years. Yeah. And that's where I'm like, I feel like this is a pretty safe. And it's easy to blame things. It's easy to say it's a purity culture thing. Yeah. And not see that purity culture was an improper response to a human tendency.
Yeah.
Right?
And like most things, I think probably started from a really good, genuine spot.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. So many things
started with somebody going, let's try to have, teens not having casual sex.
Totally. Yeah. And have the weight of the guilt that can come with that and the struggle and all that removed in their lives. So let's set up the standard rules that they can practice to be able to get there, right? And it becomes the same as Wesley's Holiness Club that then led into much of the holiness movement.
Yep.
I love what Wesley was doing. I despise what the holiness movement became in a lot of ways, right? Yeah, like the world that I grew up in, the speaking around this stuff, I have to acknowledge skewed my view, and it's just where that still is having a hold in my thinking and those kind of patterns of. I remember distinctly there was one time when I went to a movie with a friend and his dad in Bible college. And there was a scene where a girl was topless, and I immediately out of habit like looked away because I'm like, I can't see that, or I don't even, or maybe she's in a bikini. I didn't see enough because I quickly reacted and looked away. And both of them watched through it. And I remember talking in the car on the way home. It's like, why didn't you guys look away? Just genuinely curious, not even accusatory. And them going, because it wasn't struggling. It was like 2 seconds, and it was a part of the scene. We moved on. Like I wasn't thinking about that after, and that thought was going to permeate in my mind of the millisecond that I saw for the remainder of the night. And I think the language growing up as a teenager of speaking of females and how they dressed being so objectified, so you better watch out and they better change their clothes. It's like, don't think of pink elephants, don't think of pink elephants, don't think of pink elephants. All I'm thinking of is pink elephants. That the saturation of conversation around sex in an unhealthy way skewed an unhealthy way of thinking about it. So it took a long time for me to begin to engage with females without that being jumping to the forefront of my thinking.
100%.
And so my world really was impacted by that to be able to navigate it. And I think I've done a pretty good job, but I just don't know where those roots still are attached in my thinking and my processing at all times.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right on. Okay, so question number 1 today then. Within expectations in others, I struggle with expecting such a high standard when I know that imperfections can be beautiful. When I expect more, it's never ended well for me. What is the difference between hope and expectations? And how biblically can I reach hope within others and the future rather than disappointment and unrealistic expectations? Instead of expecting God to do something, how can I hear what is from him in these circumstances?
This is a deep question, and speaks to a lot of deep core elements of your personhood. Whoever submitted this, like you are wrestling with some deep inner things. And so I want to just begin by acknowledging that our answer here will speak universally to some of the aspects of your question. But again, I would encourage you, if you feel like this answer is not able to speak directly to what you're saying, to seek out some pastoral counsel and some pastoral advice, or advice and counsel from someone you know and trust as being godly and spiritual and further along the path of you to help you process this.
Yeah.
Because I want to recognize that some of the questions sometimes seem to come in from a place of, I'm genuinely wrestling with where the Spirit of God is working in my life.
Yep.
And we probably cannot adequately speak to the specifics of that thing.
Yep.
So I want to just begin with that.
Yeah. No, great caveat to begin. I was starting not knowing the specifics of where you've struggled with this. Something that's been helpful for me and I've been able to pass along to a number of people is learning to kind of evaluate what expectations to see if they're fair to begin, so the letdown's not as hard.
Yeah.
Where I can have high expectations on a high value relationship, like my spouse, because we have regular lines of communication and we have lots of ways we've been able to clearly set those expectations together. So if you haven't had that element, that's already a miss. We can't have expectations that have not been communicated. Heard a while ago, I wish I could give credit to it, but I even used it last week. Failure to communicate expectations is just pre-planting bitterness, which is, I think, going to be really helpful in this conversation.
100%.
So if you are speaking of a high value relationship for you, somebody you're highly engaged with in your life, I'm thinking of my significant other. You may have somebody else within your life. Those expectations are going to be able to be set high. I think at the same time, somebody that's been put into an office where those expectations should be clear, a boss should have set responsibilities to have been able to have made it into that environment. I'm thinking more of like a corporate structure. My manager, I'm not speaking to my environment, but like a manager has been set there and elevated for such purposes, and the standards in our HR policies are evaluated well. You should be able to have those clear. Or somebody of a level of authority, like a pastor, police officer. I believe like some offices just set the level of expectation high to begin. Beyond those few examples that I'm thinking of, I think we then begin to lower the level of expectations based on where the person situates in our life and the reality of what I'm expecting on them based on their proficiency or abilities. My expectations on all three of my kids at different ages and personalities are higher, ranging on skill set and personality and age. Just as one cheeky example, they're going to be set there versus if I'm expecting somebody to live beyond what I know and have historically been able to see in them, and I continue to set an expectation beyond their practice, I'm the one who's then set myself up for disappointment. I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to, again, because I don't know the specifics of this, but watching the continued patterns of somebody and then continuously hoping for more out of them is going to be more frustrating and heartbreaking on your end than theirs. It's always going to hurt you far more than them if you're constantly setting an expectation. And those are a few immediate thoughts that come just as kind of setting boundaries or at least of conversation. But I'd love to get into more with you guys, so I'll stop there for a minute.
Well, just to build on what you're saying about your kids.
Yep.
And I think it's easy to go, okay, I have a different set of expectations for my 2-year-old than my 5-year-old than my 8-year-old.
Yep.
I think we can, and I think we should do the same thing with the relationships with people around us who are adults.
Very much so.
That sometimes just because somebody's an adult doesn't mean we can have the same expectation of every person.
Totally.
And so I think it's okay to reevaluate what is this person capable of, and am I expecting too much based on what they have shown in this relationship? And do I need to adjust my expectations? Even like if you go to the parable of Jesus where he talks about, the master is going away and he gives one, depending on the book, 10, 5, and 1, or 5, 2, and 1.
Yeah.
There's a different set of expectations based on what he gives each of those servants. Mm-hmm. And so before they do anything, there's an element of some sort of relational aspect and some sort of expectation in the story that the master says to the one servant, I'm giving you 5, and to the other servant, I'm giving you 2, and to the other one, I'm giving you 1. And so you could say that's not fair. I would say that was probably based on
past experience.
Yes, and a set of expectation built on that. So I do think that if somebody is consistently incapable of hitting your or if someone is consistently not meeting your expectations, then I think you have to evaluate, are my expectations reasonable? And I think if you reach the point where you're like, my expectations are reasonable for this relationship. Let me give you an example. So your expectations are, hey, if I reach out to this person, they will respond. Because sometimes that doesn't happen. Or, if we have a friendship and it's only one way. I'm always supporting, I'm always helping, I'm always initiating, I'm always doing everything. It's not, I think, unreasonable to go, if with this a friendship, it should go both ways. Then maybe you need to go, okay, for whatever reason, this is an unrealistic expectation, and I need to adjust it accordingly. And that's okay. I think we should be, we should give ourselves the freedom and the ability to do that. So but I would also say, on the flip side, I really like a number of years ago when Johnny was the pastor here, he did a sermon on expectations and the difference between expectancy and expectations. Expectations are that I have defined what your response should be. Expectancy is that I should have a sense that you will do something good. Right? There will be some sort of response that is reasonable and accurate. And I do think, and I'm not speaking to this person specifically because I can't, but I think we could evaluate, do I have expectations? Do I have expectancy? Is this person doing good in response, but it's something that's just different than my expectations, and because it's not what I'm expecting, I'm missing it? In which case, again, there needs to be an adjustment in there. And so I think this is a very complicated and can be, and this is where I think it's hard to answer this question, I think, to probably the satisfaction of the person who answered it, because what is driving this question could be multiple things.
Totally.
Yeah, I'll dive into that a little bit as far as saying, I think you guys have done a really good job at defining like expectations in a relationship, and how, whether they meet that or not, and evaluating that. But also the question leaves it open anyways to think about like what's what's going on in my own heart. If this is me thinking about expectations on other people, or even the person asking the question, there's just kind of simple things that most of us have our identity based on, or our worth, and where we find value.
Yeah.
And the three big ones, I think, probably are, some people are people pleasers, right? That would be me, so I'm going to gain a lot of value by making sure that everybody around me is pleased with me, right? Some people like control, so they need every situation to be controlled, and then they find value in that and find worth in their identity and all that stuff. And then others need to be successful and need to succeed at something, right? Like it needs to always be whatever, done well, perfectionist, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
All those are okay, right? That's just us and the way we're wired, but all of them are not okay when it comes to our identity should be in God first, right? Like we should find our value in God. We should believe that He died for us. Therefore, we're loved. So I don't need to please people to feel loved. I can find that in Christ first. But if you are able to identify which of those you are, it sometimes leads into then your expectations on other people, right? What you think about them. And just something to ponder on is, I love the question in the sense that you're already asking the question, which means you're self-reflecting already, right? Yeah. A lot of people, as we were reading a book this morning, don't think very much, right? And, just would be disappointed or hurt or mad because these expectations don't get met. Yeah. But to even ask the question means you're doing a little bit of self-reflection as to, what's the difference between expectation and hope, which I think you guys kind of talked about, but then can go a little deeper too and going, what's driving me? How come I have those expectations? How come this is bugging me so badly? Yeah. Is it actually a disappointment in the other person because they're not meeting, realistic expectations? Or is this me problem where I just have this, expectations on everybody because I'm trying to feel my own need or worth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read into this question a little bit.
Sure.
And I'm going to assume that probably the person who's asking it is somebody who holds themselves to a high standard.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was
think that this is probably somebody who has high expectations of themselves. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not putting that down. And probably says, like if I'm going to be somebody's friend, I expect to do this. And if I'm going to commit to something, I expect to give 110%. And everything I commit to, I do to the best of my ability. And there's always a struggle when we have that drivenness in our personality to then assume that everybody else should have the same.
Totally.
And for me, a verse that I think of that I think is very applicable to this is Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And it's those first two, to act justly and love mercy, that as I was reflecting on this verse a number of years ago, I remember thinking about this, being like, okay, well, if you act justly, why would you love mercy? Because if you act justly, you don't need mercy. And typically we struggle with that. Yep. Because if we act justly, then we love justice. If we don't act justly, then we love mercy.
Yep.
And so this is a tension in this verse that I think we just blow by, we don't think about, and we don't ponder the depths of why this verse is in the scripture and why, like, if it's clear and self-evident, and this is, I think, a lot of times, we blow past scripture because, like, yeah, I know. If it was that evident, why did God need to tell Micah to tell the people of Israel to do it?
Yeah.
Because we're not good at it naturally. If we act justly, then, like I say, we typically love justice and we want justice. And it is a hard thing to hold myself to a standard that I'm not holding other people to.
Yep.
And this is the beauty of Jesus.
Yep.
Right? Jesus came and never sinned and sat with tax collectors and sinners and ate with them.
Yep.
The Pharisees, they didn't sin.
Yep.
Like, they were very righteous. They acted justly, but they couldn't get their hearts at the same time as acting justly to love mercy.
Yep.
And to see that how that manifests in my life is this: I'm holding myself to a standard that I'm not going to hold other people to.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we have it reversed. I'm going to hold other people to a standard that I'm not holding myself to.
Yes.
And that's the normal, I think, human condition because when we fail, we know all the reasons why we failed.
Yep.
And then so we can list off all the reasons why we failed. And we can be like, well, yes, but this was and we can explain why we need mercy while we hold other people to justice. But for some people, it's the opposite.
Yep.
And it is, I do live justly.
Yeah.
And the result of that is, man, why can't everybody just behave justly? Like, I have just this expectation that everybody should just do what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage you to spend some time maybe reflecting on Micah 6:8 and thinking about how do I continue to live justly? And I kudos to you if you are in this place where you're holding yourself to this high standard. I think the challenge might be I need to learn to embrace a mindset of mercy towards other people while still holding myself to a high standard.
Yeah. I think within that, using lines of communication to be able to bridge some of those gaps, asking questions why. Hey, what's going on? Whatever the expectation is, again, I'm thinking work analogies. That report was due last week. Why didn't I get it? And asking, and then those things can come up. Well, my dog died, or I was sick, or whatever, and all of a sudden we begin to see the layers. I think a helpful place to start as the one on the side with the expectations too, though, to be able to have a little bit more mercy to continue on with that language, and to keep hope alive, because I think expectation gets dashed with failure. Hope can stay alive through a number of failures. Would be assume the best. Assume there's probably something I'm not seeing to be able to hope for that person better. And I think the language of expectancy versus expectations would be really able to be seamed in there for the word hope, or exchanged in for the word hope. I just believe that this person means the best and can do well. And so my expectations are, whether they are reasonable or not, I can hope for the person to be able to meet them at some point, even if they've missed them the last 3, 4, 5 times. With that said, there are practical realities for both sides within the world, again, depending on what this relationship is. If this is a work relationship, there are standards that can be set that can reflect mercy beyond maybe what the HR policy in that environment can be, and can exceed those. But at the same time, there's also a reality that can go, these things have not been met. We need to break this relationship from a work perspective. That's a whole different conversation when it's a marriage. You've failed my expectations. I'm not leaving here, and I'm not letting you leave either. We need to figure this out. So you need to dig into the trench. So again, it's going to ebb and flow based on what that relationship is, and without specifics, it's hard to communicate that. But there is, even within the ministry of Jesus, evidence of both depending on the relationship. Jesus, I always find comfort when I have had to make the difficult decision to either stop trusting somebody with something or expect more out of a group of people, is when Jesus tells the disciples, knock the dust off your feet if they won't hear it and move on, when he sends out the 72. That is comforting language for me, for a Savior who believes and will do everything for all, that there is sometimes a time where it's just not right now, where it's let's shake the dust off our feet and move on from that village. In his context, I think that's applicable in other areas, where again, as you define the relationship and figure out what those expectations are, when you've had fair ones, that you've evaluated your expectations and their life and had good lines of communication, where we can break those relationships, because I think sometimes there is and can be an end to some, based on what those can be. And so for you, realizing, I think there's a deep Christian history in realizing the brokenness of this world, that is a part of our belief, that all of us are sinful and broken and struggling humans, where we're going to fail expectations in relationships and other tasks we set our hand towards. So to start with that, not in a negative sense, but in a realistic sense. People are going to let me down. That can become a very pessimistic way of thinking of the world, but it also become really unhealthy to not acknowledge it, and to constantly expect better. And I feel like you're feeling the weight on that other end. And so the only thing and person we can trust is God. That is all. Everybody else will let us down. And I know how pessimistic that sounds, but it's this back to tension. There's a reality that we live in, and then with that, we can still hope for the reality of God making us better and more whole, especially for other believers, that we will hold out hope for the betterment of humanity because of the God we serve and can trust, while also realizing we're working with broken, sinful people, of which I am one.
Yeah. So you said assume the best.
Yep.
But then I think what you said after that kind of qualified that a little bit.
Yeah.
So if I could qualify that,
Sure.
I think assume the best until the person proves that that's an unrealistic expectation.
Great clarification.
Right? Until that's
Thank you.
and I think that then you don't have to end the relationship, but you might have to redefine it.
Yep.
And so as a pastor,
Yep.
you have, and I think that people don't realize, the average Christian, I don't think we think enough or we talk enough in the church about that we are all called to be priests and the priesthood of all believers, and we're all called to be ministers. But as a pastor, you get pretty quickly in ministry to the realization that there are some people who you can have a peer-to-peer relationship with, and there's some people you're going to have a ministry relationship with. And it's not saying anything bad about anybody. It's just going, okay, in this relationship, this is going to be one where I'm predominantly going to give.
Yep.
I'm not going to receive. And so I need to adjust my expectations in this relationship because I've chosen to be a pastor. So I'm not saying it's from any place of bitterness. It's just from a place of wisdom and practicing and realizing that God has given me this grace to serve others. And in that service of others, there will be some people who are peers, who I can lean on them and they can lean on me. And there are going to, and this is not exclusive to pastors, I use that as an illustration because that's our world.
Yeah.
But for all of us, there are going to be other people who, this is going to be a ministry relationship. That is going to be one where I'm going to be predominantly a giver. And I think, to go back to your first analogy, like if you look at in a healthy marriage, there's a peer-to-peer relationship, and you look at your relationship with your kids, it is not a peer-to-peer relationship. No. And you do not have much expectations. Even when your kids later in life, you understand as a parent, if you're doing it with a clear mindset, that you are going to give far more than you're going to receive.
Correct.
And that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're bitter at your kids in any way.
Nope.
You just understand innately you have chosen to be the parent to this kid. And that comes with a responsibility.
Always a disbalance in this relationship because of that.
Yes. And I think a healthy parent recognizes that and they embrace that. I think in the same way, we can look at every one of our relationships, and we should look at every one of our relationships at times and kind of reevaluate them if there's this ongoing issue that pops up into it and go, okay, well, am I expecting this relationship to be a peer-to-peer relationship? And is it meeting that standard? And if it's not, then I need to redefine it. It doesn't mean I need to cut off relationship with this person, although if there's elements of toxicity or abuse, or maybe you do. But I don't feel like that's where this question is coming from. I feel like maybe there's a recognition that goes, you know what? This is a relationship that I need to recognize that, hey, I care about this person. I love this person. I have grace in my heart towards this person that comes from a sense of the Holy Spirit speaking to me and putting a passion for this person in my life. So I need to redefine this relationship as one where I'm going to predominantly be the giver. And then from that, reshape all of my expectations of what this relationship will be. And so I think we need to recognize that there are people that we're going to be peers with, and there are people we're going to be ministers to. And that is part of our calling as followers of Jesus, because we are called to be priests. All of us.
Cool.
I'll add, I think another element to this too is when those expectations, like when we're aware, right? Like in any relationship, you expect and believe that it's going to be awesome, especially in a newer relationship. And then eventually you're like, oh, maybe it's not what I thought it was going to be. If you want that relationship to continue, if it's not one where you're like, it's either not worth pursuing any longer, or, one that you're going to distance yourself just because of the reasons you just explained, Doug. I think praying for another person is huge. And not praying just that they'll get it right. Praying blessing for someone, actually praying that their life would be blessed. I think gives opportunity for God to soften our hearts, which can totally change how we relate to somebody. Jesus tells us to pray for enemies, and I don't get the sense that this person necessarily is an enemy. But at the same time, when people fail our expectations, they do start
over time,
to slide towards that category, right? So I think as I'm hearing you guys speak and thinking about it, I'm like, I can think of relationships in my life where now that I'm getting better at identifying these things and taking Jesus seriously and praying for people, that there is some good that can happen when I pray blessing over people. And I think especially for my children, for my wife, those really deep relationships, it has caused me, and I don't know if it caused everybody, but it has caused me to be less petty in certain situations, right? Where again, it's maybe, and I say petty meaning like both ways. Like they obviously aren't meeting the expectations. That's disappointing, and maybe they should be better. But there's also an issue of me where I can let that really bother me, right? And it can become entrenched where I do start to build up bitterness and resentment and those things.
Yeah.
But if I'm praying for them, that will not happen. Like I just don't think you can pray blessing over somebody and at the same time your heart get hard towards them. It doesn't work that way. So maybe something to try out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you need to keep praying blessing over that person until you mean it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. That I would say that. I would say that for sure.
There's been situations
You
where
need
it's been
to
like,
fake it.
It's a while.
I will keep praying this blessing until my heart comes into alignment with what my mouth is saying.
Yeah.
And it's not always a quick process.
Well, and especially for an enemy, right? Like, I've given people that advice. Like, you pray for Jim out there, right, who's horribly offended me. And
For all the Jims out there, you guys are the worst.
You pray that Jim, that his wife would love him, even if, I don't know how, but I pray, whatever it is. You pray until. I like that, Doug.
Yeah. Cool. The end of this question talks about expecting God to do something in these circumstances. Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to the relationship again. Yeah. Like I've got this expectation of this person. This is how I'm reading the question. So let me just let me state if to the person who asked the question, if I'm reading the wrong way into this question, feel free to clarify with some AER. And I think it can even be some frustration that gets redirected in the context of this question to God, because I've had this expectation of a person and they haven't met it. So I've been praying for this person and now I'm frustrated with God because God hasn't done something to help this person. Do you want to respond to that at all?
I was more, I didn't read that part that way. I was more reading, instead of just expecting God to supernaturally just change their mind, what do I want to hear from him? And that, for me, was back to the confidence in him and trusting in him and the hope for ability of people to change. Okay. Is more how I read that one.
Okay.
So my lines of thinking hadn't gone there.
Okay.
Yeah, but you feel free to jump in.
I don't necessarily have an answer to it. I just wanted to make sure that we were acknowledging that if they're now getting to this point of being frustrated with God, what does somebody do in that place? And I think, but like I guess my initial thought would just be like, we need to, the same thing. I need to have a sense of expectancy and hope that God is going to work good in every situation. Yeah. And I think part of the problems that we have in 21st century North American Christianity is we have been taught that we can define what that hope looks like. Yeah. Instead of leaving that up to God. Yeah. And I think of the same thing, like my kids, like how many times my kids will have an idea. I'm like, we're going to do something fun. Yep. And their idea of something fun is A, but I want to do B, and B is so much better. But they get their heart set on A that they're like, I don't want to do anything but A, and you're the worst. And it's like, well, A is kind of lame.
Yeah, totally. I think the only other thought that's coming quickly to mind is recognizing God's presence or patience with me, is often what I hear back in those scenarios because he has been abundantly patient with me and will continue to have to be, unfortunately. And so that is often a humbling thing for me, and his patience with humanity, period. Again, I'm never going to get sick of referencing how the patient ferment of the early church. Like, I may not ever see the change in my lifetime in whatever thing may be frustrating, but to hold out in a belief of a God who will make all wrong right at some point is the most grounding part of a view of God you can hold, and his love towards humanity. I think it's going to be helpful.
Yeah, I didn't read the question that way either, but I can take it that way and think of, disappointment with God because he doesn't make me happy, right? Or, this relationship is brutal, so I'm out. And I think I've said on the podcast before some time ago, but I just think there is relationships that God has invited me into that he has an expectation of me. Mm-hmm. And I just think that those ones matter. And often those ones probably aren't very fulfilling back towards me. They'd be more in that ministry category that you're talking about. But I just think I've regularly thought about the pearly gate experience. Like, what happens when you get to heaven, right? What is, who is standing there? What does it look like? And I have this just the thing that runs through my mind, and it's just probably me, but I just think that sometimes Paul, Peter, Jesus, whoever's standing there might ask me about those people that he put in my place.
Yep.
So-and-so, how did you treat them? I'm like, that guy was a jerk. I hated him. I got rid of him as soon as I could, Jesus, just like you would want me to, right? I don't know if that's going to answer the question correctly.
Weird.
So I do need, and I would encourage anybody listening to this, maybe not necessarily the person asking this question because I don't feel like they asked it this way, but anybody listening, to evaluate that.
Yeah.
Sometimes there might be something that Jesus is inviting you into
Yeah.
that is hard, a relationship that is hard.
Yeah.
And I would also say, let me just clarify one thing about the peer/ministry relationships. You don't have to tell the person if you reassign them. No, I think that's worth saying.
It is. Totally. Very worth
You've been
saying.
downgraded. This is no longer
It's not
equal.
downgrading.
I'm just kidding. Just play it off.
But I because I don't want them to think that, right?
No.
No, absolutely not.
But I think you don't have to say anything.
Yep.
You just have to change your expectations of that relationship, and you have to maybe put a different set of boundaries around your life. Like maybe this person doesn't have access to you 24/7 because they can't.
Yeah.
Because you need time to be with peers. You need time to be with Jesus. You need time to reconnect. But you don't have to say something. You just have to continue to love them.
Yeah.
And if it is a ministry relationship, they won't even realize that you have shifted things.
Yeah.
How you continue to be there for them, they will continue to see. But I just want us to, I don't want people walking around. I think of the meme where, there's a picture and it's used as a meme of Kermit the Frog standing looking out and rain. And there's one and it was like, after the sermon where the pastor says to be nice to the difficult to get along people when everyone comes up to shake your hand. Everyone in the church comes and talks to you after the pastor preaches that message. We don't need to do that.
Yeah.
We just need to keep loving, but just maybe adjust the internal state of our heart.
Yeah.
So, because if it is a ministry relationship, they are looking to you maybe as more of a mentor, a leader, a guide than you even realize.
Yeah.
And then you have to be all the more careful about how you interact with that person because they are putting more trust in you than you even realized.
Yeah.
And so you should approach that relationship even more humbly and even more carefully. So I don't want people at all to think it's a downgrade. It's a redefining the relationship, but it does come with more of a sense of sober responsibility that, like you said, there's people in our lives who God has put there because he wants us to care for that person for whatever reason. We don't understand why God chose us to be with that person or to be that person's, Paul to Timothy. But we should approach that relationship then with less expectations, but with greater amount of humility.
Very true.
I like it.
That's well said. Do you think we have time to jump into the next question, or we probably got about 10 minutes left?
If you can answer it in 10 minutes, yes. If not, maybe no.
Keelan's saying 10 minutes. I think maybe we should save it
There's
for next
that,
week.
or we could jump one question to one about the movie The Prince of Egypt, which I don't know if we'll have as long of rabbit trails on it.
You want to go there?
We can.
All right. I just lost my
Easier.
questions.
Do you want me to read it for you?
Sure, go ahead. If you'd
I
like
was
to.
recently watching the movie The Prince of Egypt and noticed that one of the plagues seemed to be fire from the sky. And when I noticed that, I realized that I've seen other movies depict that before too. When I read about the plagues, though, that doesn't seem to be mentioned. Is there a translation in which fire from the sky is one of the plagues of Egypt, or do you think that is just the creators of those films trying to make it more dramatic, as though locusts and frogs and bloody water, etc., aren't dramatic enough?
I like that.
So
we need
just-
fire from the sky as well.
Last week I pulled it up quick to read through because I was struck by that. I haven't watched The Prince of Egypt in a long time, though. I actually saw a clip about it. I was like, I should show my kids that. I don't know why I felt that. That was my response. But I pulled up the passage. So Exodus 9 does have this, which might help. And there was hail and fire was flashing back and forth in the midst of the very severe hail, the like of which was not in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. And then it says in verse 25, and the hail struck in all the land of Egypt and was in the field from human animal and hail struck all the vegetation of Egypt and was smashed every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where all the Israelites were, there was no hail. So it mentions the fire in there, though not coming from the sky. And so I wonder if it's just the artistic expression trying to put those two pictures together. Hail and fire was flashing back and forth in the midst of the very severe hail. Not sure. They just got to imagine how the flashing was taking place, and that would be my quick bringing it together.
I need to begin by confessing I've never seen The Prince of Egypt. There's a lot of kids movies that I've never seen, and that would be one of them. So I can't speak to that at all. But if you've ever watched there's a channel on YouTube that's called Pitch Meetings.
Yes.
Which is this one guy who films all the parts.
Yes.
And they're brilliant. And he does fictitious pitch meetings
For
of
movies.
once
Yeah.
they're out. And so it's awesome.
Yeah.
They're just fantastic. But having watched probably every one of them that's ever been made,
Yeah.
one of the things they talk about when it comes to superhero movies is how often there's a sky beam in the finale. How often there's some sort of giant light going up to the sky as part of the climax because it's so dramatic.
Yep.
And he will make fun of the fact that, like, it's the third act. We have to have a faceless, nameless CGI army that's defeated, and we have to have a sky beam. And so when I read this question, I just think of Pitch Meeting, and I think of, well, how are we going to depict this? A beam going up to the sky. That's so dramatic because it is a movie trope.
Yep.
There you go.
There you go. I don't know how else, like in a modern day, I could see how hail could cause like explosions by hitting electric poles or something
totally,
like
yeah.
that. Like there's ways that it could happen. We're talking ancient Egypt. I don't know what those applicable things are.
Wait. There are some people who say that the pyramids were not actually burial places of the kings,
This is true.
but were power structures.
But
And
those same people would also claim that it wasn't the Egyptians who actually built the pyramids. It was a pre-existing civilization.
Correct.
And the people who lived in Egypt at the time of this had just taken over what was left behind.
And they
Correct.
would have been really surprised when those things lit up in the hailstorm because they're like, we didn't know these were power sources.
Or
Also
what
that.
if they took it over and there was power lines everywhere
Yep.
in ancient Egypt and everybody had electricity in their house until that hailstorm? They just didn't understand what it was.
No way.
And then the hail caused all the
Ruined
power
it all.
lines and electrical cables to, come crashing to the ground and put literally Egypt into the Dark Ages.
And I thought this question was going to have no rabbit trails. Look
I
at
was
me.
like, this is getting better by the minute. I'm like getting excited now. And again, we're going to turn off the cameras. And you guys are going to miss out on all the good stuff.
If you got any AER on that,
If, when. Oh, my.
Awesome.
Love it.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this episode of the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope that you will visit our website, invertedorthodoxy.com. You can leave us a like and share and all those good things. You can also ask your questions anonymously, and we love answering them. We will see you next week.